with advisor Sean Riley. The general area of study or interest is human dimensions of wildlife. Has a BS in ecology from the University of Montana and a master's in environmental policy from Michigan Tech. And the presentation this morning will be Michigan Nature-Based Recreationists and Support for Conservation.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Bear with me while I get this started. All right. Yeah, I'll be presenting some of the results from my dissertation research, focusing on a survey of nature-based recreationists in Michigan. I'd like to quickly just thank my co-authors, my advisor, Sean Riley, and Emily Pomerantz, the Human Dimensions Research Coordinator at the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, for all their help. And also acknowledge sources of funding for this project. The MDNR Wildlife Division provided the main source of funds, with supplementary funding provided by the Rural Sociological Society, as well as Safari Club International Michigan Involvement Committee. All right, so just to give some background on the rationale for this research, really comes down in large part to shifting demographics. So the structure and the composition of our society is changing in some pretty major ways. The population is growing, aging, becoming more ethnically diverse, and increasingly urbanized. These trends can affect people's values and attitudes and their behaviors, and that includes the leisure activities that people pursue. So that has implications for wildlife management and conservation. Fewer and fewer people are engaging in traditional activities like hunting and angling. Numbers of hunters in Michigan have been declining for a couple decades, primarily due to an aging baby boomer population that has historically had a high proportion of hunters. So that leads to questions of funding for conservation, and brings up questions of who should be paying for these benefits that are being received by a broad and diverse base of stakeholders whose voices haven't always been represented in the decision-making process. So my dissertation research aims to address this issue by examining the extent to which nature-based outdoor recreationists in Michigan have the potential to support these conservation efforts from social or economic perspectives. So the focus of this talk is going to be on the results of a survey that I conducted last year. We sent a little over 500,000 survey invitations to individuals on the MDNR's email database. We received about 19,000 responses, and we assessed participation in 11 different nature-based activities, as well as associated psychological and behavioral variables. So respondents were skewed slightly male at 56% to 41% female, predominantly from a white ethnic background, tended to be college educated, a mean or average age of 54.6 with a range from 19 to 96. So I used structural equation modeling to look at some of the relationships between these variables. So if you're not familiar, I'm going to call it SEM because it's easier. If you're not familiar with SEM, it's an approach that encompasses different methodologies like path analysis, factor analysis, mediation, linear regression, and allows us to look at multiple models simultaneously and estimate relationships between different kinds of variables. Observed variables are what are in your data set. They're what you measure, what you observe, and they're represented in these path models by rectangles or squares. Latent variables, these are things that are not observed directly, but they're things that we wish we could see directly. Like, classic examples are socioeconomic status or scholastic aptitude, well-being and happiness, or in the case of this study, support for conservation. And these latent variables are represented by ovals in these path models. So these latent concepts, they tend to be composite of several different things, and latent variables can capture that. So it's a stepwise process. We first define these latent constructs through exploratory factor analysis. And we operationalize this latent construct of support for conservation by using items adapted from previous scales that measure pro-environmental behaviors. So the items on the survey were things like, we asked how often someone voted for a policy or a regulation that might support wildlife, how often they engaged in habitat improvement on private land, volunteering time, donating money to conservation organizations, attending meetings, contacting elected officials, things like that. So SEM is very theory driven. So the hypotheses concerning the relationships between these variables were derived from previous research and various psychological and behavioral theories like value belief norm theory and the theory of reasoned action. Other variables that we hypothesized that would mediate this relationship between participation in nature-based recreation and pro-environmental behavior are things like motivations, recreation specialization, values, and place attachment, among a few others. So motivations we measured using items adapted from recreation experience preference scales, and exploratory factor analysis indicated that there were 3 different types of motivations. We titled those social motivations, achievement-oriented, and intrinsic. Recreation specialization is a construct that puts recreationists on a spectrum from beginner to expert based on their knowledge and skill and commitment. And this has been shown in prior research to influence things like motivations and support for management. We measured underlying values using items adapted from wildlife value orientation scales. These reflect basic beliefs about the relationship between humans and wildlife and nature. This is also on a spectrum from utilitarian or use-oriented beliefs on one side to mutualistic or protection-oriented beliefs on the other side. And then we also incorporated place-based constructs to account for the symbolic or emotional attachment that recreationists attach to their places where they recreate. So the next step is confirmatory factor analysis. This resulted in a measurement model with 9 latent constructs. So just as a reminder, each of these latent variables, these are unobserved, but they have several of the observed variables attached to them. And each observed item has a factor loading, and that's a measure of how well that item loads onto the latent construct. I didn't list all the individual factor loadings because it would make the table very muddy. But items generally loaded pretty well on these latent factors, and anything less than 0.4 was dropped from the analysis. Alpha and composite reliability scores indicate acceptable internal consistency within these latent constructs. Average variance extracted is kind of like an R-squared value. It estimates how much variance in the latent construct is accounted for by the observed items. All right, so here you can see this proposed structural model with pro-environmental behavior, or PEB, on the right as the dependent variable, as well as hypothesized causal relationships that lead to that PEB. Fitting the model with Stata estimates parameters like path coefficients, covariances, and error terms. And I've left a lot of this stuff off because I want to draw more attention to the directionality and the relative strength of these relationships. So dotted gray lines indicate paths that were not statistically significant. Red lines indicate a negative relationship, green lines a positive relationship, and the thicker the line, the stronger the effect. So there's only one negative path here, and that's between intrinsic motivations and pro-environmental behavior. So intrinsic motivations are very inward focused. Examples on the survey were things like escaping stress of everyday life, experiencing solitude, or enjoying time spent in nature. So it's possible that as somebody becomes more intrinsically motivated, they might be more focused on their own experience and the psychological benefits that they receive, and consequently, they might be less likely to engage in these pro-environmental behaviors. Achievement-oriented motivations appear to have a strong positive effect. So these were items like learning about nature and wildlife, or challenging one's skills, improving your abilities, things like that. So as somebody becomes more strongly motivated by achievement factors, they might be more likely to engage in pro-environmental behavior. What's interesting is that different types of motivations, all three of them, appear to mediate this relationship between things like specialization and place attachment and their effect on pro-environmental behavior. So these each have direct effects, but they're also mediated through these different types of motivations that could affect that relationship. So the type of motivation seems to matter. For example, someone who's highly specialized and motivated by achievement-oriented factors might have a strong likelihood to engage in PEB, while somebody who's also highly specialized in their recreational activity but motivated by intrinsic factors might have the opposite relationship. So goodness of fit statistics here in the bottom of the left corner. Evaluating these models is as much of an art as it is a science, and it involves theoretical considerations, like I mentioned earlier, considering alternative models, but also looking at these fit indices. So these four are commonly reported. You generally want a chi-square less than 0.05, sorry, an RMSEA less than 0.08, a CFI of 0.9 or above, and an SRMR of less than 0.08. So these fit indices generally are saying that this model is a good fit for the data, which is a positive step, and it lets me know that I'm not completely off base and that there might be some real world implications. But that's not the end of the road. So the next steps are to look more closely at the mediation effect of different motivational types and consider some of these indirect effects on pro-environmental behavior. Group analysis can give us a sense of whether these relationships are the same for different types of recreationists. So we've segmented recreationists into certain types, so we can look at wildlife associated recreation, hunting, fishing, wildlife watching, and whether that might be different from hikers, mountain bikers, campers, and other groups. And additionally, further modeling will incorporate other measures of this idea of support for conservation to assess whether people are willing to support economic policies directly that would increase funding for wildlife conservation. Okay, so just to wrap things up, the diversity and the number of stakeholders who have an interest in recreation and public lands and wildlife and conservation is continually increasing, and that leads to added complexity for management and creates challenges for a funding model that's dependent on declining activities like hunting. So broadening this discussion of conservation requires knowing something about the values and the motivations of this diverse group of nature-based recreationists and what potential they have to provide support. Evidence from this model suggests that concepts like place attachment, recreation specialization, motivations are important to understand because recreationists hold diverse values and goals and preferences, and all of these interact to affect their likelihood of engaging in different types of environmental stewardship. So understanding how these things are related might be useful for managers and planners for providing, for a diverse range of experiences, but also in leveraging the potential that this group of stakeholders has to provide advocacy and support for wildlife conservation in the future. So with that, I can attempt to answer any questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Chris. All right, there are some questions. I'll read them to you.
Okay.
Were you able to determine how the demographics of your survey responders compare to the demographics either of individuals who received the survey or demographics of Michigan residents as a whole?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The sample was from this, this MDNR database. Here, I'll turn my video back on. And there's no demographic information attached to that database. It's different from like, the hunting license database where people give you their demographic information. So I don't have, a general sense of what that looks like. So it's hard to find something to compare to. And that's definitely something that I'm still working with in terms of what it means for the bias that's in the sample. And, I think it generally represents pretty well the people who would sign up for MDNR emails. But that's about all that I can say for certain.
Okay, that kind of aligns with the next question, which was, you started your talk by saying that demographics are changing by becoming more ethnically diverse and urbanized. How well do you think your results capture motivations of these new demographics?
Yeah, it's a pretty homogeneous sample, right? It was 90% white, and that's something that I wish I could speak to more, but I just can't with the sample that we have. We had to work with the sample that we had access to. There's no centralized database of nature-based recreationists, and so you kind of have to find them and access them where you can. And so that's something that I wish I could speak more to with these results, because I think that's a pretty important issue.
We all wish we had more data, huh?
Yeah.
All right. How does the response rate of 4% to the survey compare to other surveys like this? And what is like the effect of reliability?
Yep. Definitely another good question. So it's low. It's definitely lower than a lot of surveys, but it still resulted in a large sample size of over 19,000, just because the original pool of people that we sent the survey to was 500,000. So low proportion overall, still a large sample size, so allows us to do these types of analysis and be confident in the results. But whether that really represents the target population is still something that we are discussing.
And then why do you think achievement-oriented motivations were most strongly related to pro-environmental behavior? Conceptually, it seems to me like the least likely to have the strong relationship compared to social and intrinsic motivations.
Right. Yeah. I'm still thinking about that one. Achievement-oriented motivations, the way we measured it in the survey, it was things like learning about wildlife and nature. So it's potential that the more you learn about it, the more you become aware of the adverse consequences that people have on nature. And that makes you more willing to do something to mitigate that. And the same with intrinsic motivations, it shows a negative relationship, which is kind of interesting, but maybe as you become more focused on yourself and your own experience, you don't gain that awareness in quite the same way.
All right. Does anybody else have any more questions? We could probably squeeze one more in here. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. And then I am done moderating.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Is going to be Alexandra Benitez. She's a second-year master's student advised by Dr. Abigail Bennett. She's interested in environmental science, public health, and qualitative research. She got her bachelor's in science from the University of Puerto Rico, and she's going to be giving